Hello, everybody. So it's always tough doing a talk after lunch, but hopefully you all have been refueled, either on your Astron energy or maybe some of your hydrogen fuel, as long as it's no methane. And if you are filled up with methane, please, will you just excuse yourself at the back there. So I think one of the things that, especially hearing from the minister earlier this morning, looking at all of the challenges that you face as an industry, I think we all left with a bit of road fright. So hopefully, thank you. I've been working on that one for at least 2 hours, so I'm glad it went down well. So thanks for the introduction, Bongani, and yeah, I'll be chatting about the future. It's something incredibly important for any industry, but in particular your industry. It is so vital to our South African economy in terms of its butterfly effects affecting pretty much everything from services to produce and products. And you know, if you think about even just the journey of a truck driver, someone on the road, you're constantly entertaining uncertainties all the time. Is the car next to me going to pull in front of me? Is there going to be a pedestrian that's going to walk across the road? How do I play with all of these uncertainties and balance it such that I'm still an effective and efficient driver? So I love the saying that you guys have, because it's so true around, without road freight, the South African economy stops. But it did make me think in terms of how we think about the future and the external environment. And if you flip it on its head, what it means for you as an industry. If the South African economy stops, what happens to road freight? And I think it's something that you've got to consider. I think if you look at the politics and the economics of the country, if you look at political and labor unrest, if you look at in terms of the fuel price now, if you look at load shedding, there are a number of factors that are shaping South Africa's economy. And as much as you're an integral part of that in terms of providing for the economy also provides for you. And if that picture is changing, what does it mean for you as an industry? What does it mean for you as a CEO or a CFO? What does it mean if you're an HR executive? What does it mean for your organization going forward? So I want you to reflect on that as we delve into some of the concepts that I'm going to touch on. Now I want to start off with this saying, or this quote, because I think it sums up the importance of thinking the future quite well. So this was from a senior British Foreign Office official that served between 1903 and 1950. He said, year after year, the warriors and the fretters would come to me with awful predictions of the outbreak of war. I denied it each time, and I was wrong only twice. Now, of course, technically speaking, that's pretty good. You know, if maybe they came to him 100 times, and he denied it every time, he was wrong only twice, that's 98 out of 100. I mean, that's brilliant. But the 2 times he got it wrong, tens of millions of people lost their lives. And I think it highlights the importance of thinking the future, the fine margins that shape our world, and how integrated and complicated it can all be, and how we need to be constantly looking around for different flags that indicate changes in our environment. And how then, as Bongani said, do we adapt to that, like Tilly Smith did, and how many lives she would have saved. So, glass full of water, half full, half empty, what do you think? Pessimist, optimist. So I want everyone in the room to put up your hand if you're a pessimist about the future of South Africa. If you think that things are going to get worse. Okay, one hand. That feels like a bit of a lie, but your only other option is optimist. So how many people here are optimistic about the future of South Africa? Most of us. Okay, very interesting in terms of what are some of the facts, what are some of the narratives, what are some of the things that are informing that opinion that you make? What makes you an optimist? Or what makes you a pessimist? Now, I'm going to say all of you are wrong. And I'll tell you why. If you want to effectively think about the future, you can't be one or the other. You've got to see things from both angles. If you're an optimist, it means you've got blinkers on. It means you're discounting all the negative things that should be informing a more robust and holistic picture of the future. At the same time, if you're only looking at the negatives, it drives this assumption in your head that things are definitely going to get worse. And there's so many headline-grabbing doom stats in South Africa that it's quite easy to say, it's going to hell in a handbasket. I'm going to share with you a few stats. So the argument of the pessimist for the one person that put their hand up. Between January and March this year, there were 6,083 people murdered and 10,818 people raped between January and March. More than a month lost to load shedding, again, just in this year alone. Our unemployment rate, as you all know, just under 35%. Now, these are very scary statistics. And if that informed your opinion, if that informed your view of the future of South Africa, it would be pretty bleak, wouldn't it? Conversely, the argument of optimists, so most of the people in this room might be touching on these stats. Cape Town ranked third best city in the world, according to a recent Daily Telegraph survey. Over 60 million people in the country, 28% of which are younger than 15, which means we have incredibly good young demographics. We have a burgeoning class that are going to come into the world, work, taxes, growth, everything that comes with young people. And South Africa provides more than 70% of the global platinum supply, which is becoming an increasingly important source in the global economy. So, I'm going to ask you again, who's right? If you were to build up a narrative as a pessimist and you highlighted those terrible figures, or if you highlighted those figures as an optimist, which one's right? Now, of course, they're both right, because they're the same country that the stats refer to. It depends on how you perceive it in your mind, and whether you're questioning those assumptions that you make about South Africa. And you're saying, okay, that's a negative statistic. How do I see the broader context around that? How do I understand how there might be more nuance or complications to that picture? How do I balance the view a little bit? Not balance for balance sake, but to understand that there's more to this world than what first meets the eye. So hopefully what I'm going to help you do today is highlight 4 principles to good futures thinking. So if you were either an optimist or a pessimist, and I've shown you that you need to be both, here are some other principles that you can employ to make sure that you're a better futures thinker going forward, whether it be professionally or personally. So the first one I'm going to highlight is around control. When we look to the future, what's inside of our control? To do that, I'm going to tell a story. So this is a beautiful painting by Turner, and it depicts a ship in a storm. Now I want you to imagine that you're on that ship. The rain is pelting down, thunder booming around your skull, big waves towering over the ship. What kind of emotional state are you in? You're probably panicking, right? You're probably thinking, wow, I'm scared right now. This is daunting. I'm anxious. I'm panicking. I'm being frantic. Now, this is the story of a guy named Zeno of Citium in ancient Greece. He was a wealthy merchant, and he was on his way from Piraeus to Phoenicia. And on board his ship was a very, very valuable cargo. It was a purple dye used to dye the togas of the kind of aristocracy and the ruling class and the emperors of the time. And the way you got that purple dye was through painstakingly excreting this dye from these kind of sea snails. And kind of like saffron today, where you have to look at millions of them in order to get a small amount of this dye. So that's what was on board the ship, and the storm hit. And the ship completely got destroyed. Zeno got washed ashore, and he had nothing. He was now penniless. All of his fortune was gone on that ship. He looked around, he went to a bookshop, and eventually found a book from one of Socrates' followers. and was so astounded by what he read, he said, no, I want to find someone that thinks like this. So he followed a philosopher down the road and eventually led to some kind of enlightenment for himself. And he would practice his philosophy like I am on the stage on this place called Stoa Pekile, which is in ancient Athens. And that is the Greek name for a porch. And that's where we get the thinking of the Stoics. Philosophy on the porch, Stoa Pekile, the Stoics. And they made this distinction between what is inside of your control and what is outside of your control. And they said almost everything that we engage with is outside of our control. Whether it be the economy or politics, the weather, our relationships, all of these things, so many of them, all of it, in fact, is beyond our control. What is within our control is our judgments on things, what we think about how we engage with the world. And there's maybe a thin little sliver where it's neither full control but also not completely out of your control, something that you can influence to some degree. Now, the Stoics use this to inform how to live a happy, fulfilling life. But as a strategist, as someone who's looking at your future from a personal sense or a professional sense, as you're making decisions about what to do, you need to understand this, that so much of what we speak about today, in terms of whether it be the economic stuff that we heard from the Investec analysts or whether from Mangama in terms of the political stuff, a lot of that is beyond your control. What then sits within your control in terms of how you navigate that space? And having that understanding of that distinction between what's inside your control and what's beyond your control is crucially important to thinking the future more effectively. Now, Marcus Aurelius was a very famous emperor, and he was also famous for being a Stoic, and he wrote a book called The Meditations, which was kind of internal reflections on his own life. And he said, never let the future disturb you. You will meet it, if you have to, with the same weapons of reason which today arm you against the present. And that's what these principles will hopefully help you do, to say, the future seems like this big, scary, opaque, hazy thing. But really, you've got to engage with it in the same way you engage with reality around you, through rational, logical principles. Number 2, questioning your assumptions. So again, I'm going to look back and you'll probably see a theme in terms of bringing all of these ancients to modern life. But this is a beautiful picture, in my mind, one of the most beautiful paintings ever produced from Raphael, called The School of Athens, done in the 16th century. And really it's a Where's Wally of ancient Greek philosophers. See Heraclitus here, you see Archimedes in the corner there, Alexander the Great, Plato, Aristotle. Interestingly, Raphael made Plato look like Leonardo da Vinci, and this guy here, Heraclitus, looked like Michelangelo as a kind of ode to the masters. And there are all these different figures, but I want to highlight one in particular, and that's Socrates. And you'll see he's dressed in green. He was renowned for being very ugly in the time. And he's holding out his fingers, counting together the premises of an argument to basically tell these people that they're logically inconsistent, in a nutshell. Now, what he was famous for is the fact that no matter what you do in terms of your interrogation of life, you need to constantly question your assumptions. Now, he eventually got put to death for that very reason, because the rest of ancient Athens couldn't handle his level of questioning, because he would look at and engage with different people in the forum and say, what do you think about justice? What is knowledge? What is power? They would give a response and he'd question them, eventually show that their conception of what justice is was wrong. It was logically inconsistent. And so his kind of point was that living a life, an unexamined life, is not worth living. And another way to think of it in a modern sense is the game of Jenga. If you think about how you build this edifice of knowledge that you have, it's all based on these foundations. You would know if you play the game, you pick out those ones on the top, it's a lot safer, isn't it? Whereas if you try to pick these ones at the bottom, the whole thing can come tumbling down. Now, if you have some fundamental assumptions at the bottom of this stack, you better make sure that you interrogate them in terms of the strength of the foundations. You don't build a house on weak foundations. You've got to have strong underlying assumptions to your belief. So he said an unexamined life is not worth living. And I've adapted it to say an unexamined future is not worth thinking. And I want you to just reflect on how you think about the future and how often you just blindly kind of see one reality. You think, okay, this is how things are going to turn out. I bet you this is what's going to happen. We very easily fall into that trap. We've got to constantly examine our future, question those assumptions. Third one, reperceive the future. Now, this is one of my big heroes, Pierre Wack. He was a scenario planner in the 1970s, worked actually closely with Clem Sunter, one of my partners, in terms of teaching him what he knows about scenario planning. And, we played some golf yesterday, and thanks to Angama, highlighted that we came second, which was cool. I thought I'd put that in there as well. And interestingly, when I was listening to The Economist earlier from Investec, I was thinking, what would be the number one key indicator that would dictate the future of the country, which way it's going, whether it's going to get better or whether it's going to get worse? Now, Pierre Wack thought about that about Japan in the 1980s. And he interestingly said, you've got to look at golf club membership. And everyone was like, what? What are you talking about? Remember, Japan at the time was flying. They were growing at more than 10%. They were what China is today. They were kind of this big new economic power arriving in the world with real force and real growth behind them. And he says Japan's going to collapse. Everyone was thinking, what are you looking at? Golf club membership. Golf club membership was in decline. And if you think about it, what starts happening when you start tightening your belts? When you have that excess income, you don't get rid of your children's schooling and your house and your mortgage. You start getting rid of your golf club membership, those things, those luxuries you can do without. And there was a sharp decline, and he said that's the first flag you got to think about to see that the future of Japan is going to be tough. Combine that with the fact they're an aging population, a lot of them over 40 and 50 years old, means that they're going to be drawing on their pensions, there's not going to be that growth, and it's going to be stagnant for a long time. And that's exactly what happened. And he said, don't go through life as a blinkered racehorse looking straight in front of you. Take the blinkers off to see the future around you. Now, I just want to put that in practice for you, and these were some scenarios that I thought of, especially over the last couple of days, but just researching road freight in terms of some of the uncertainties you face. And if we plot it onto a game board like this, if we look at two fundamental key uncertainties around labor unrest that you've had in the industry, and then also the fuel price. Now, if you look at these two key uncertainties, they paint four very different scenarios for your industry going forward. If there is a big reduction in the fuel price and you have labor stability, it's a keep on trucking scenario. That's your best case scenario. Things are good. Conversely, if you have a reduction in fuel price but you have labor unrest, might be a bit of a roadblock. Okay, you're still getting the efficiencies in terms of your margins from the fuel price, but the labor is unstable. Conversely, if you think of labor stability but an increasing fuel price, especially with what's going on with Ukraine and Russia, you might have a running on empty scenario. You just cannot afford to carry on business as usual. And then finally, a worst case scenario where you have a high fuel price and labor unrest in South Africa. And that's really where potholes are going to get you. Now, you've got to think about you as a business and you as a leader in your business or your organization and say, what is our strategy in each one of these scenarios? Because it can't be the same strategy. Gone are the days where you have a vision, mission, goals, and KPIs, because that's based on an assumption of how you think the future is going to turn out. You need to say, how do we bring these scenarios into it such that our decisions here are quite different from our decisions there? Now, the fourth and final one, reason is the slave of passion. So this was inspired by David Hume, who was a Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, and he's often quoted as saying, reason is the slave of passion, but what people miss out is this extra little bit. Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. And I just want to highlight just a quick story before I end around how this maps out. So Nick Bostrom, who's a Swedish philosopher, came up with this wild thought and this thought experiment where he said, okay, let's look at artificial intelligence. Let's play it out into the future. So the word for robot actually comes from a Czech word, robota, which means forced labor or slave. And he said, let's imagine we charge this artificial intelligence to start making paper clips. And we gave it the rules to say, make the most paper clips you can as efficiently as you can. Eventually, this machine will start making paper clips, making paper clips, making paper clips. Eventually, it'll start bringing in all sorts of things to make more paper clips and make them more efficient. Eventually, it's going to start co-opting humans. It's going to start bringing in all sorts of resources. It's going to eventually just get to this point where our world is taken over by this machine because it is just blindly guarded by this principle of make as many paper clips as you can as efficiently as possible. What it doesn't have is human empathy. Now, the human empathy is that ability to reason, to say, okay, hold on, just fulfilling this task isn't what we desire. Now, the passions are what guide us in terms of our motivations to do things. It's our passions and our motivations that say, this is what we ought to do. Reason is the thing that guides us to say, this is how we are going to do it. So that's what David Hume was meaning when he said, reason is and ought to be slave of the passions. Because he says that reason in and of itself is motivationally inert. We've got to have these passions that drive us forward, that make us want to be better. And then reason's what helps us get there. So the theme of the conference, reset. Okay? Now, very complicated, uncertain picture. There's so many uncertainties around the future. How do you reset? What does it mean to face up to these enormous challenges you have as an industry? Now, I want to leave you with one last quote, one last story, just to give you a bit of hope, to say that, how do you surmount these difficult challenges, but also what is the importance of imagining how things can play out differently. So King Philip of Macedon, who was Alexander the Great's father, was flushed with a number of victories all around ancient Greece. He was raiding all of these towns and basically secured most of the surrounding area in Greece and got to Sparta and completely besieged the city, completely surrounded them. And he issued them an ultimatum. And he said, if I defeat you, we will raze your city to the ground. We will kill every man and boy in the city and take every woman and girl into slavery, and sent that to the Spartans. The Spartans sent a one-word reply. If. So I'll leave it there. Open for some questions. Thanks.
Just to remind everyone, we don't have any questions that have come through yet, but if you do, just to remind everyone, please send them via Menti. And perhaps whilst we get one or two, let me ask a question of my own. The last couple of years, I keep repeating this, the last couple of years, there's so many unforeseen scenarios. Are there things that in 2019 you would have been able to tell us that would have better prepared us for what we've been through these last 2 or 3 years?
It's a great question, and I get it quite often, so I've kind of got an answer in my head. So when we do, from a Mind of Fox perspective, I work with a number of different businesses across different industries, and we run strategy sessions where we'll get the board or the executive in a room and we'll work through their strategy over the next 5 or 10 years. And in the process, we highlight key uncertainties, like I did there in terms of labor unrest and fuel price. So they list all these key uncertainties, and almost every single company that I worked for in that period leading up to 2020, they always put a pandemic on the list of key uncertainties. But then that's where it stayed. On the flip chart, they did some scenarios around the other key uncertainties. They built their strategy, and that's where it stayed. They never really entertained the idea beyond saying that's a possible key uncertainty. Now, what I'm trying to frame here is that even if you're a scenario planner, that's what people say, are you a futurist? And I say, well, hold on, what is a futurist? Scenario planner imagines these different scenarios, but you can't imagine every possible scenario because there would be an infinite number of scenarios. So rather, you've got to just try and entertain a few. But what's more important, instead of looking at the outcome of these predictions, so the outcome of those 4 scenarios, it's the process that's important. So what you leave with today hopefully won't be, these are possible scenarios. Rather, It's the importance, the understanding that you need to be thinking with scenarios going forward. That's where you build in the adaptability and agility. It's not that scenarios are better forms of prediction. It's understanding that you can't predict the future, and you need to constantly think in scenarios. That's what's going to make you a good strategist and a good futures thinker.
All right. Why is your company called Mind of a Fox?
Okay, so another question I get often. So I've got another good answer, or an answer. You'll define it, whether it's good or not. But so Archilochus, who's an ancient Greek poet, wrote a poem of which only a fragment survived, which says, "The fox knows many things and the hedgehog one big thing." And a philosopher by the name of IIbury, based in Oxford in the 1950s, who actually taught Clem when Clem was there at Oxford doing a PPE, he took that concept and said, if you look at some of history's greatest thinkers over the last few hundred years, they're either foxes or they're hedgehogs. You have the hedgehogs, which have one big idea and summarize everything they see in the world according to that big idea. Someone like Karl Marx. You know, he had a theory, an economic theory, and that explained everything for him. And everything he saw was within that idea. Whereas you have foxes who are rather more comfortable in complexity and uncertainty and say, oh, hold on, there are lots of contradictions around. And there's no one big theory that's going to summarize everything. Rather, I need to look at the different pieces of the puzzle and kind of base my assumption on that evidence, but I've always got to be able to revise my assumptions and not be too stubbornly focused. And so we thinking like a fox in this modern, complex, complicated and uncertain world, we got to be more foxy in our thinking. We've got to be more dynamic in our strategic approach rather than being a hedgehog like maybe Jim Collins would have told you to be 20 years ago.
Taking the lead from your if example, what is your view on the most important key uncertainties that business should take into account in South Africa and the broader continent?
Excellent question. And it'd be very hard and wrong of me to just point to just one, because it would mean that we're excluding the others, and I don't want you to be too myopic in your view. But there are a number of flags from a South African perspective that we at Mind of a Fox are watching. I suppose that would be somewhat of a helpful answer. I think the debate around land reform, if you look at electricity and basically utilities in terms of water management as well, corruption, some of our pockets of excellence, and we have many brilliant schools in South Africa, we have a great financial sector, but there are pockets. Are those pockets in decline or are they growing? Are their best practices being spread? I would look at basic education as well, very, very poor. That's the number one key determinant of a successful nation. If you don't get education right, nothing's going to flow from there. The butterfly effect is too massive from education. So I'd be looking at some of those key uncertainties regarding South Africa, and then, globally, I would expand it, especially around what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, but then more broadly, I think, and more dangerously, what's going to happen between the United States and China. I think over the next decade, that's going to be a defining key uncertainty to watch, and start thinking about what are the flags that would indicate that bubbling over to the point of war.
All right, just waiting for them to come through. No, don't have it. Do you base all your scenario planning on ancient stories, ancient examples?
Well, you'll have to read Clem and my book in order to know whether that's the case, but I will give a short answer to say that both Clem and I studied philosophy in our undergrads, and it's one of our big bonding points. And I think that there's so much we can learn from the ancients, but also philosophers in general. And why I say that is because philosophers are very logical and rational. They never bind themselves, or a good philosopher, I should say, never binds themselves to a single theory. If they have a theory, they will critique it and critique it and critique it to see what merits this belief. And I think that's a very good attribute for thinking the future. Don't just take your assumptions on face value. How do you critique them, question those assumptions, and ultimately, that process is what's going to help you think the future more effectively. But there are a few other thinkers that we highlight in the book across the spectrum.
Who's your favorite philosopher and why?
Aristotle. He was the ultimate fox, and if you remember that painting, him and Plato were actually in the middle. And Plato has his hand pointing to the sky, and that's because he had a theory of the forms that said everything we see in the world is a copy of this ideal form, this blueprint, this mathematical realm that has the ideal forms of things. That's why he was the ultimate hedgehog in a way, because that informed his view on everything, whereas Aristotle has his hand pointing down to the ground. And that's because he was really the father of science that said we can't take our cue from some mysterious realm that you're speaking of. We've got to look at the evidence around us and build up a picture from what we see. And that's why he was the ultimate fox. So he would be my favorite.